Have you ever noticed that after a certain moment in life, you simply could not go back, even if you tried? Not back to tolerating the same behavior, not back to explaining yourself, not back to shrinking your truth to keep the peace. Awakening does not arrive like a lightning strike. It arrives quietly, almost invisibly, as a deep inner certainty that makes returning to the old self impossible. For many women, especially those who have lived, loved, lost, endured, and reflected for decades, awakening begins not with confidence but with clarity. Something inside shifts. A line appears where none existed before. She does not become louder or more aggressive. She becomes grounded. She feels, often for the first time, where her energy ends and where the expectations of others begin. What once felt normal suddenly feels invasive. What once was tolerated now feels unbearable. This is the part that few people talk about. Awakening is not about becoming softer or more spiritual in the way it is often portrayed. It is not about endless forgiveness, positivity, or self-sacrifice. Awakening is about no longer being able to betray yourself. And here is the shocking truth many never consider. The reason awakened women seem intimidating, distant, or unapproachable is not that they are closed, it is because they are finally aligned. Carl Jung described this process as individuation. It is not the pursuit of improvement. It is the return to wholeness. Individuation pulls energy back from roles, personas, and survival patterns that once kept you safe, but no longer reflect who you are. For a woman, this often means releasing the identity of the one who over-explains, over-gives, over-tolerates, and over-adapts. She does not set boundaries to control others. She sets them because her inner world demands coherence. This is where red lines are born. Not rules written on paper, but inner thresholds that cannot be crossed without consequence. An awakened woman no longer negotiates these lines. She does not announce them. She does not defend them. She simply lives from them. Her nervous system, her intuition, and her body are now aligned. When something violates her truth, she feels it immediately. The discomfort is no longer vague, it is precise. This is also why awakening can feel lonely. When you stop abandoning yourself, some people lose access to you. Not because you rejected them, but because the version of you they relied on no longer exists. Jung understood that when a person individuates, they disturb the unconscious expectations of others. Your clarity exposes where others still operate unconsciously. That exposure is not always welcomed. This introduction is not about teaching you how to become awakened. It is about helping you recognize that if you are here, something has already changed. You are not becoming colder. You are becoming exact. You are not less loving. You are more honest. Awakening has no way back, because once you know where your soul stands, you cannot pretend not to feel it. And from this place, there are lines that will never be crossed again. At some point, you wake up and realize that continuing to play a role now costs more than refusing it. This realization often begins quietly, then suddenly becomes impossible to ignore. Imagine a woman in her 40s who has always been known as the dependable one at work. She takes on extra tasks, smooths over conflicts, and stays late so others can leave early. For years, this identity earned her praise. One morning, she feels a strange resistance in her body as she prepares for another day of performing that role. Nothing dramatic has happened, yet something inside her refuses to cooperate. The mask no longer fits. This is how the first red line appears, not as rebellion, but as inner truth asserting itself. The awakened woman begins to sense that the identity she has been wearing was never truly hers. It was shaped by family expectations, cultural rewards, and survival needs formed long before she had the language to choose differently. She learned early that being agreeable brought safety, being capable brought approval, being quiet avoided conflict. Over time, these adaptations hardened into a persona. Carl Jung described the persona as the social mask we wear to function in the world. It is not false by nature, but it becomes destructive when mistaken for the self. In real life, this red line shows up in small but profound moments. A woman who once laughed at jokes that made her uncomfortable now feels a tightening in her chest when she tries to do it again. A partner expects her to always be understanding, even when she is hurt, and for the first time, she cannot access that familiar compliance. A family member assumes she will absorb criticism without response, and she surprises herself by going silent instead of apologizing. These moments feel awkward, even frightening, because the old reflex no longer activates. The problem is not that others suddenly changed. The problem is that she did. Jung taught that individuation requires the gradual dismantling of the persona. This dismantling creates tension because the world was organized around who you pretended to be. When the mask falls, people experience disorientation. They may accuse her of being selfish, distant, or difficult. Yet, from a psychological perspective, this resistance is predictable. Systems depend on consistency. When one person stops playing their assigned role, the system attempts to restore balance by pressuring them back into it. This is where many women feel tempted to retreat. They wonder if awakening means becoming cold or unkind. They question whether they are overreacting, but the body tells a different story. Returning to the mask now feels physically draining. Headaches appear after forced conversations. Fatigue follows social gatherings where she performs instead of participating. Jung understood the psyche as a self-regulating system. When the inner self is ignored, symptoms emerge to force awareness. The discomfort is not punishment, it is guidance. The climax of this red line arrives when she realizes a startling truth. She cannot unknow what she now knows. Once she sees the gap between who she is and who she pretended to be, pretending becomes a form of self-betrayal. This is the irreversible nature of awakening. She does not reject others out of anger. She simply cannot continue a performance that costs her integrity. So the question becomes unavoidable. Who are you without the roles you learned to survive? Who are you when approval is no longer the currency you trade for belonging? And are you willing to let others be uncomfortable so that you can finally be real? There is a moment when compassion turns into quiet depletion, and the awakened woman finally names it. This red line begins not with anger, but with clarity. Picture a woman who has always been the emotional anchor in her relationships. Friends call her late at night to unload their fears. A partner leans on her whenever life feels heavy. Family members assume she will absorb tension and keep the peace. For years, she believed this was love. One evening, after another long conversation where she listened, reassured, and carried someone else's pain, she hung up the phone and felt strangely empty. Not tired in the body, but hollow inside. Something essential has been crossed. This is the problem many awakened women face. They were taught that love means limitless access, that being caring means being available at all times, that empathy requires taking on what others cannot hold themselves. In daily life, this looks like staying in conversations that feel invasive, tolerating emotional dumping, or feeling responsible for fixing someone else's moods. Jung described this blurred psychological state as participation mystique, where the boundary between self and other dissolves. In this state, emotions pass freely without consent, and identity becomes entangled. As awareness grows, the awakened woman begins to notice the cost. She may feel anxious after certain interactions without knowing why. Her body tightens when someone approaches her with yet another crisis. She might wake up feeling drained even after a full night of rest. These are not signs of selfishness. They are signals that her energy is being crossed. Jung believed that psychic energy must be contained to remain healthy. When energy constantly leaks outward, the self weakens. A real-life example often brings this truth into sharp focus. A woman in a long-term relationship realizes that every disagreement ends with her apologizing, soothing, and restoring emotional balance, while her own needs remain unspoken. When she finally pauses instead of comforting, her partner accuses her of being distant. Another woman stops answering every message immediately and is met with guilt-inducing comments about how she has changed. These reactions reveal something important. The connection was built on access, not mutuality. The awakened woman understands a shocking truth. Love that requires self-erasure is not love. It is emotional consumption. Jung warned that without clear boundaries, relationships become sites of unconscious possession. One person carries what the other refuses to face. When she installs an energetic gate, she does not close her heart. She clarifies it. She listens without absorbing. She cares without collapsing. She remains present without merging. To those who benefited from her former openness, this feels like rejection. They may accuse her of becoming cold or unavailable, but from her perspective, this is the first time she feels truly present with herself. She realizes that intimacy cannot exist where there is no boundary. Without a defined self, there is nothing to meet another with. The climax of this red line comes when she no longer explains herself. She simply notices where her energy ends and honors it. She understands that preserving her inner world is not abandonment. It is the foundation of any reality. So the question becomes unavoidable. Are you loving others by carrying what they refuse to hold? Or are you finally learning that love begins where self-betrayal ends? There comes a moment when silence becomes more truthful than any explanation. This red line forms when an awakened woman realizes that her life is not a courtroom and her choices are no longer on trial. Imagine a woman who decides to leave a stable job that no longer nourishes her. She feels clear inside, even calm, yet the questions begin immediately. Why would you do that now? Are you sure you are not being impulsive? What is your backup plan? At first, she answers carefully, hoping to be understood. But with each explanation, she feels her certainty thinning, as if her inner knowing is being slowly negotiated away. This is a familiar problem. Many women were conditioned to believe that autonomy must be earned through justification. Choosing rest requires a reason. Saying no requires a story. Changing direction requires approval. In everyday life, this looks like over-explaining a boundary to a partner, defending personal values to family, or rehearsing reasons before making even small decisions. Jung understood this as a failure to separate from the collective voice. When the psyche is still entangled with external authority, the self seeks permission instead of truth. A real-life example often marks the shift. A woman chooses not to attend a family gathering that drains her emotionally. In the past, she would offer a detailed excuse, hoping to soften disappointment. This time, she simply says she will not be there. The response is immediate: confusion, discomfort, sometimes anger. Others press for reasons, not out of care, but out of a need to reassert influence. This is where the red line is drawn. She feels the urge to explain rise in her chest, then she notices it and lets it pass. Jung taught that individuation does not happen before an audience. The true self forms in privacy, in alignment, not through consensus. The awakened woman begins to sense the difference between genuine curiosity and subtle control. Genuine curiosity respects a boundary even without understanding it. Control demands justification as a way to reopen negotiation. When she stops explaining, she is not being dismissive. She is being precise. She understands that clarity does not require defense. This shift unsettles people who relied on her self-doubt to maintain closeness or authority. Some may accuse her of becoming cold or secretive. Others may say she has changed. She has. She no longer confuses explanation with connection. She recognizes a quiet truth. Anyone who truly respects her sovereignty does not need a reason to honor her choice. The climax of this red line arrives when she feels grounded instead of guilty. Her decisions no longer shrink under scrutiny. She speaks simply, or not at all. And the question that lingers is this: how much of your life has been shaped by the need to be understood, and what might change if your inner clarity became reason enough? There is a quiet moment when tolerance ends and clarity takes its place. This red line forms when an awakened woman realizes that not all harm comes loudly, and not all cruelty announces itself. Picture a woman in a professional meeting where a colleague smiles while making a cutting remark about her competence. It is framed as humor. Everyone laughs. In the past, she might have laughed too, telling herself not to be sensitive. But something in her body tightens. She recognizes the familiar sting. This time, she does nothing outwardly. She simply takes note. The problem many women face is subtle disrespect disguised as honesty or concern. Passive aggression, backhanded compliments, and thinly veiled humiliation are difficult to confront because they deny the victim a clear point of objection. If she reacts, she risks being labeled dramatic or insecure. Jung would recognize this as a psychological violation that operates in the shadows. The shadow does not always appear as open hostility. It often hides behind politeness, sarcasm, or so-called truth-telling. In real life, this shows up in relationships where a partner repeatedly makes comments that undermine confidence, then claims innocence. It appears in families where boundaries are mocked rather than challenged. It shows up in friendships where support is offered conditionally, laced with comparison or subtle judgment. Over time, these small cuts accumulate. The woman feels drained, confused, and diminished, yet struggles to justify her discomfort. The awakened woman develops an internal radar for these violations. She no longer debates whether something was meant badly. She pays attention to how it lands in her nervous system. Jung emphasized that individuation sharpens inner perception. As the self becomes more integrated, tolerance for psychic harm decreases. What once required explanation now requires action. Her response is not confrontation fueled by anger. It is a withdrawal rooted in self-respect. She stops sharing. She stops engaging. She removes her presence from spaces where her dignity is not protected. Silence becomes her boundary. Absence becomes her message. This often confuses those who benefited from her tolerance. They may accuse her of being distant or unforgiving. She understands something they do not. Access to her energy is not a right. This is not punishment. It is a consequence. When disrespect loses all access, the woman feels lighter, not hardened. Her energy returns to her. And the question that remains is simple, yet unsettling. How many times have you stayed present in spaces that quietly taught you to disappear? There comes a moment when compassion matures into discernment. This red line appears when an awakened woman realizes that carrying what does not belong to her is no longer kindness, but quiet self-betrayal. Imagine a woman who has always been the listener in her family. When conflict arises, everyone turns to her. She absorbs the tension, mediates the arguments, and leaves each conversation feeling heavier than before. For years, she believed this was love. One day, she notices that no one asks how she feels. The problem is subtle but pervasive. Many women are unconsciously assigned the role of emotional container. Partners unload their frustrations after work. Friends process their crises through her. Family members place unspoken guilt and expectation on her shoulders. Jung explained this through the concept of projection. When people cannot face their own anger, shame, or fear, they look for someone sensitive enough to hold it for them. The awakened woman begins to see this pattern clearly. In real life, this shows up when a partner blames her for his dissatisfaction. He feels empty or restless and assumes she must fix it. It appears when a friend repeatedly revisits the same pain but resists any responsibility for change. It surfaces in workplaces where emotional labor is expected but never acknowledged. Each time, the woman feels an unspoken pressure to soothe, repair, or carry what was never hers to begin with. As individuation deepens, something shifts inside her. She feels the difference between empathy and absorption. Jung taught that growth requires each person to confront their own shadow. When she carries someone else's unresolved emotions, she interrupts that process. What once felt like helping now feels like enabling stagnation. She begins to respond differently. She listens without taking responsibility. She names what is hers and quietly returns what is not. This refusal often destabilizes relationships. Those who relied on her emotional labor may accuse her of being cold or changed. She experiences moments of loneliness as familiar dynamics fall away. Yet this loneliness feels different. It is not chaotic or self-erasing. It is clean, clear, honest. In this space, her energy returns to her body. Her thoughts slow. Her inner world becomes quieter. The climax of this red line is liberation. By refusing emotional weight that does not belong to her, she creates room for real connection or for peaceful solitude. The question that remains for the reader is simple and unsettling. Whose emotions are you still carrying that prevent both you and them from growing? There is a quiet strength that appears when a woman realizes that staying is sometimes the deepest form of harm. This red line emerges the moment she understands that endurance is not the same as devotion. Consider a woman who has spent years adjusting herself to keep a relationship alive. She softens her needs, delays her dreams, and tells herself that love requires patience. Outwardly, nothing looks broken. Inwardly, something vital is slowly disappearing. The problem often hides behind noble language: loyalty, commitment, understanding. Many women are taught that leaving is failure, especially when no obvious abuse exists. Yet Jung warned of the martyr archetype, the unconscious role where a person sacrifices their wholeness to maintain attachment. In real life, this looks like staying with a partner who cannot meet emotionally but promises potential. It looks like remaining in a friendship where respect is conditional on silence. It looks like working in environments that reward compliance while draining the soul. As awakening deepens, the body and psyche begin to protest. She notices a persistent heaviness when she thinks about staying. Her energy drops during conversations that require her to shrink. Jung would say that the self is signaling misalignment. The relationship may not be cruel, but it is constricting. It asks her to fragment in order to belong. The awakened woman reaches a point where clarity replaces hope. She sees that waiting for someone else to change has become a way of postponing her own life. This realization is painful because it dismantles the fantasy that love must always be preserved. Yet it is also liberating. She understands that love that requires self-betrayal is not a bond, but a prison built from fear. When she leaves, she does not dramatize or explain endlessly. She does not weaponize guilt or seek validation. She simply honors the truth she can no longer ignore. This act often shocks those around her. They may accuse her of giving up or becoming selfish. But Jung taught that individuation requires choosing the path of inner truth over collective expectation. The climax of this red line is integrity. She learns that walking away can be an act of love toward herself and an act of honesty toward others. The question left for the reader is both simple and unsettling. Where are you still staying out of fear of being seen as disloyal, and what part of you is paying the price for that loyalty? There comes a moment when peace purchased with silence becomes unbearable. This red line appears when a woman realizes that keeping quiet has cost her more than speaking ever could. Picture a woman in a meeting who knows a decision is wrong but stays silent to avoid tension. Or a woman in a relationship who feels dismissed yet tells herself it is easier not to bring it up. Or a daughter who has learned that honesty in her family leads to withdrawal, so she swallows her truth and calls it maturity. These moments seem small, but they accumulate into a life lived half-voiced. The problem begins early. Many women are taught that harmony is a virtue, even when it is built on self-erasure. Jung described the self as the inviolable center of the psyche, the inner authority that knows what is true. When this center is ignored repeatedly, the psyche fragments. In real life, this fragmentation shows up as resentment without a clear cause, sudden emotional outbursts, or a quiet numbness that settles in after years of being agreeable. The awakened woman notices a shift. Each time she silences herself, her body reacts. Her chest tightens, her energy drops, her sleep becomes restless. Jung would say the unconscious is no longer willing to cooperate with the lie. Speaking up now feels risky, but staying silent feels dangerous. This is the threshold where truth begins to matter more than approval. She starts small. She names a feeling instead of suppressing it. She says no when something feels wrong, even if her voice shakes. In some cases, this leads to conflict. A partner becomes defensive. A colleague labels her difficult. A family member accuses her of changing. Yet something remarkable happens. She feels more solid afterward, not less. Temporary tension replaces long-term self-betrayal. As this red line integrates, the external world reorganizes. People who relied on her silence grow uncomfortable. Environments that demanded compliance begin to feel intolerable. Jung taught that when the self is honored, the psyche moves toward wholeness, even if the outer life must be rearranged to support it. This is not rebellion for its own sake. It is alignment. The climax of this red line is freedom of expression rooted in responsibility. She does not speak to dominate or wound. She speaks because truth has become non-negotiable. The question that remains for the reader is profound. Where are you still choosing false peace over your own voice? And what would change if you trusted that your truth deserves space to exist? After these red lines are anchored, something fundamental shifts in how the awakened woman moves through life. Her boundaries are no longer something she announces or defends. They are felt. They exist in the way she enters a room, in the calm behind her eyes, in the certainty of her presence. She no longer explains herself. because she no longer doubts herself. What once required words now communicates itself through energy, timing, and choice. Life begins to simplify. Relationships that depended on her flexibility, guilt, or silence quietly fall away, not through conflict, but through incompatibility. At first, this thinning of connections can feel unsettling. There may be moments of loneliness, especially for a woman who once carried many emotional roles for others. Yet this solitude feels different. It is spacious, restorative. It no longer feels like rejection, but relief. Jung understood this phase as a natural consequence of individuation. As the psyche becomes whole, it no longer tolerates fragmentation in the outer world. With this clarity, something unexpected happens. The anger she once carried begins to dissolve. Rage was never her true nature. It was a signal that boundaries were being crossed. Now that those crossings no longer occur, the signal is no longer needed. In its place comes calm. Not the calm of submission or avoidance, but the calm of inner authority. This calm does not seek permission. It does not rush to explain. It stands. Daily life reflects this change in subtle ways. Decisions feel cleaner. The body relaxes. Sleep deepens. She notices how often she once negotiated against herself, and how little energy that cost her now. Jung taught that when the self becomes the organizing center of the psyche, energy that was once spent on inner conflict becomes available for living. Creativity returns, curiosity returns, joy returns, not as excitement, but as steadiness. The lesson of these red lines is not about becoming untouchable or distant. It is about becoming aligned. These lines are not walls meant to keep life out. They are the sacred outline of her soul, defining where she ends and the world begins. They protect her capacity to love without self-loss, to connect without collapse, and to give without disappearing. The path of individuation always has a cost. It costs illusions, familiar roles, and relationships built on self-betrayal, but what it gives in return is something no external approval can replace. It gives her back herself. And once that return is complete, nothing essential is ever lost again. If this touched something sacred inside you, don't let it fade into silence. Like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Your presence here is not just support, it's resonance. And if you feel moved to give back, your donation becomes a quiet but powerful gesture that helps keep this light alive for others still walking in the dark.